Support WrestleTalk!
Give us a subscribe.
Since 2016, Survivor Series has been known as the Brand Warfare Show, the one night of the year where Raw and SmackDown go head-to-head in direct competition, or as some people call it, a waste of time. Survivor Series has seemingly begrudgingly been called one of WWE's Big Four shows, when in reality other shows like Money in the Bank are generally more popular in the calendar year. But that Big Four title must have come from somewhere, right? So today, it's time for a history lesson. For those of you bewildered why the November show is supposed to be a big deal, here's why Survivor Series used to be important. This video was adapted from an article in issue 24 of the WrestleTalk Magazine by Dave Bradshaw. Make sure to order your copy of the magazine using the link in the description or by visiting WrestleShop.com to get more awesome content like this. Let's take it back to the 1980s when WWE was WWF. Survivor Series hadn't been created yet, and mullets were cool. So I'm told. At the time, WWF were reluctant to run shows on Thanksgiving. Firstly, because the holiday was reputedly Vince McMahon's favorite, and therefore not a day when he wanted to be running a show. And secondly, because it was far from clear that enough fans would be persuaded to get off the sofa and travel to an arena just hours after gorging on their biggest meal of the year. That being said, at least two of McMahon's biggest rivals have been drawing strong crowds on Turkey Day since the early 1960s. Vern Gagne's AWA and Jim Crockett Promotions. The latter staged a major show at the Greensboro Coliseum in South Carolina, which had become an integral part of the city's annual celebrations. In 1983, that show had become Starrcade, the biggest night on the National Wrestling Alliance's calendar, and was shown live via closed circuit to around 30,000 fans at 17 other venues across the Carolinas, in addition to the 15,000 who were watching in person. The annual supercard continued to grow in popularity, and in 1985, Greensboro shared the event with the Omni in Atlanta, another city where live wrestling was an established feature of Thanksgiving Day, which really just goes to show that WrestleMania wasn't quite the leap of faith that people make it out to be. It was just doing something that had already been done by the NWA on a bigger scale. Closed circuit venues? Done that. Multiple venues? Check that off the list. But there was one thing that Vince McMahon really was the pioneer of in the wrestling world. Pay-per-view. Vince was quick to see the potential of emerging technology that allowed viewers to purchase a live event and watch it from the comfort of their own homes, well before his competitors and mostly before other sports such as boxing embraced it. As early as November 1985, he experimented with offering fans an event via this new medium, and by WrestleMania 3 in March 1987, it was clear that the gamble had paid off. Over 400,000 American households paid to see Hulk Hogan slam Andre the Giant in the Silverdome that night, almost 1 in 10 of all homes that had pay-per-view capability at that time. Inevitably, Jim Crockett Jr. saw this success and wanted a piece of the action. The competition between the two companies had been heating up for some time, and Crockett had started offering lucrative contracts to his top talents with guaranteed salaries to deter them from jumping ship. Man, this sounds so familiar in 2020. I can't think why. He had also bought several other territories in an attempt to expand his promotion and to prevent McMahon from gaining a nationwide monopoly on televised pro wrestling. This was a risky business model, but Crockett believed he could make it work by getting into the pay-per-view game and offering 4 events each year, as WWF still only had WrestleMania. Starrcade 1987 would therefore be Crockett's first pay-per-view offering, and it was moved from Greensboro to Chicago as part of an effort to present the company as being more than just a southern regional territory. Unfortunately, Crockett had not counted on the ruthless response that this would provoke from his rival in New York. Upon getting wind of Crockett's pay-per-view plans, McMahon made it clear to cable companies across the country that if they carried Starrcade, then he would bar them from presenting WrestleMania 4 a few months later. Exactly how Survivor Series came to be created amidst this drama depends on who you believe. The Wrestling Observer and several other sources have claimed that McMahon concocted the event as soon as he heard about Crockett's pay-per-view plans in order to spite his opponents, but Bruce Pritchard has more recently insisted that it was the cable companies who asked for an alternative if they were being asked to forego the payday from Starrcade. Either way, McMahon booked the Richfield Coliseum and doubled down on his ultimatum, refusing a compromise whereby Starrcade would move to the afternoon, allowing the cable companies to present the two shows one after another. Survivor Series 1987 was a go. Given that WrestleMania was a proven commodity while Starrcade had no pay-per-view track record, the outcome was perhaps inevitable. Of the dozens of companies that had planned to carry Starrcade, all but 5 dropped out. 4 on Crockett's home turf in the Carolinas, and randomly 1 in San Jose. Realizing that Starrcade was in trouble, Crockett frantically booked over 100 closed-circuit venues to also show Starrcade, but couldn't undo the damage inflicted by McMahon's power play. When all was said and done, only 30,000 people saw Starrcade 87 live or via closed circuit, while over 10 times that amount watched Survivor Series. It was a hammer blow to Crockett that cost him an estimated $2 million and arguably sent him on the path to bankruptcy. When Crockett presented his second pay-per-view Bunkhouse Stampede in January 1988, the WWF undermined its sales by presenting another brand new concept on the same night. This time a free special on USA Network called the Royal Rumble. Don't know whatever happened to that one. Crockett's failed attempt to retaliate by broadcasting Clash of the Champions on the same night as WrestleMania 4 spelled the end for him, and before long, Ted Turner bought the business for $9 million and rebranded it as World Championship Wrestling. The Survivor Series show itself was designed to be a completely different experience than WrestleMania. At the time, WWF relied heavily on house show revenue, where fans would see singles matches between wrestlers who'd been feuding on TV, and Vince didn't want to give away these matches on pay-per-view, except at WrestleMania, of course. It was for this reason that the idea was formed: elimination tag matches where fans could see the wrestlers in feuds on TV wrestle each other, but keep enough left in the tank to still be able to see the eventual singles bout further down the line. It was generally well received, and fans were clearly sold on the opportunity to see a main event in which Hulk Hogan and Andre the Giant faced off in the ring for supposedly the first time since the Silverdome, though in reality they'd actually fought in untelevised matches more recently. There was also no doubt that Survivor Series had the edge over Starrcade in production values. Having learned from doing TV specials with NBC, the WWF ensured the crowd in the arena was well lit and included plenty of sweeping shots of the arena from up high, giving the whole presentation a big-time feel. Overall, that night of the 26th of November 1987 was a clear victory for McMahon over Crockett. 1 year later was Survivor Series 88. Despite backstage drama surrounding real-life beef between Dynamite Kid and Jacques Rougeau, forcing Rougeau and his brother Ray to be eliminated first in the match opposite the Bulldogs and leave the arena while the match was still going on, the show was more well-received than the previous year, due in a large part to the debut of Mr. Perfect Curt Hennig, who would cement his star power the following year with another captivating performance. A small injury for Owen Hart aside, the show went well and buoyed the company into Survivor Series 1989. WWF smartly made the choice to trim down the teams so it was a 4-on-4 affair as opposed to 5-on-5. Mr. Perfect was back with another stellar performance alongside Rick Rude and the Rougeaus, defeating Roddy Piper's team. But possibly more importantly, Zeus was there. He captained a team against Hulk Hogan in order to promote WWF's movie No Holds Barred that released the previous summer. But it was the Ultimate Warrior who'd be standing tall at the end of the show after his beatdown of Bobby Heenan, which would propel him into a feud with Hogan not long after. Heenan was supposed to be in a managerial role for that match, but due to Tully Blanchard failing a drugs test on the day of the show due to partying the night before, he stepped in for the match. And it was another last-minute replacement that stole the show 1 year later at Survivor Series 1990, in what would prove to be one of the most important debuts in WWF history, and another example of Vince McMahon being smarter than his competition. Enter one Mark Calaway. Calaway was a promising young heavyweight from Texas. He'd signed a short-term deal for WCW in 1989 and was working there as Mean Mark Callis. But with his contract up for renewal, Booker Ole Anderson made it clear that he did not believe the public would ever pay money to see him perform. With the writing on the wall, Calaway started to explore the possibility of jumping to the WWF. McMahon was initially not interested in meeting him, having been unimpressed by Calaway's outing against Lex Luger at WCW's Great American Bash in July 1990, a match in which Calaway had competed despite having a dislocated hip. However, the two men finally met in August and immediately gelled. Calaway soon gave his notice to WCW and wrestled his final match there in early September. At the same time in WWF, Bad News Brown was upset at his payoff from that year's SummerSlam, and according to interviews he gave in years later, felt that McMahon had reneged on a promise to make him the first black world champion in the company's history. Brown walked away from the company, leaving a vacancy on the Survivor Series card, which was very fortuitous for young Mark Calaway, who stepped in and, as introduced by Ted DiBiase, debuted as The Undertaker. Unusually for WWF at the time, his new character debuted without any prior vignettes on television to introduce him or even an announcement that he would be replacing Brown. The fans heard the name The Undertaker for the first time that night, and they'd hear it many, many more times through the decades to come. Survivor Series 1990 is also fondly remembered due to another outstanding performance from Bret Hart. This was the second year in a row that Bret had turned heads with his performance at Survivor Series. The previous year, when he had tagged into a match and found himself staring across the ring at Randy Savage, the crowd reaction was so huge that Savage immediately took him to McMahon after the show and asked to work a program with him. These back-to-back standout moments at consecutive Survivor Series events undoubtedly helped to persuade the company to pull the trigger on the singles push for Hart that would launch him into superstar status in 1991. Also, the Gobbledygooker debuted that night, and the less said about that, the better. Arguably, the 1990 Survivor Series was the last edition of the event before the concept began to be watered down. It was the last time that WWF chose to run the show on Thanksgiving Day, moving it to Thanksgiving Eve for the next 4 years with mediocre results, before finally making it a Sunday show like almost every other pay-per-view event run by the company. The 1990 show was also the last time that the card consisted exclusively of elimination tag matches, with Undertaker defeating Hogan for his first WWF title in a singles match in 1991. By 1992, 7 of the 8 matches on the card were not traditional Survivor Series matches. By this point, WWF had long since added Royal Rumble and SummerSlam to its pay-per-view calendar, with more events added in the years that followed. Although Survivor Series still had its fair share of historic moments for several years to come, including this small thing known as the Montreal Screwjob in 1997, it eventually became lost in the shuffle and was only nominally one of the company's Big Four events. By 2010, WWE announced its plans to scrap the event altogether, though they later abandoned that plan, and the Survivor Series brand has limped on ever since, often feeling like an unloved old toy in comparison to the other 3 pay-per-views from that era. Still, as we have seen, this certainly was not the case in its wild early years. Survivor Series was at the heart of several of Vince McMahon's biggest early successes, from the 1987 ultimatum that helped put Jim Crockett out of business to the 1990 debut of a man who would become one of the WWF's biggest ever stars, having been told by WCW that he wasn't worth a dime. These were crucial triumphs for McMahon that put him in pole position at the start of the turbulent 1990s, a decade in which the two companies would fight for their very survival. Without the head start that these victories gave him, it's entirely possible that WWE would now be nothing more than a faded memory, and that is why Survivor Series is so important. Once again, thank you to Dave Bradshaw for writing the article in issue 24 of the WrestleTalk magazine this video was adapted from. Make sure to order your copy by using the link in the description or visiting WrestleShop.com, and press the videos on screen to catch up with more Wrestle2 content, including a 1-year review of the Wednesday Night Wars. I've been Chopper P. Quinnell. Jam that jam.